So when you hear the term insulin resistance, I'm willing to bet that most of you are thinking diabetes, insulin, diabetes. And that is true. Insulin resistance does lead to diabetes. But now we know, based on Benjamin Bickman's research and work and delving into the studies and the pathophysiology of the body, that most diseases, most chronic degenerative illnesses, diseases, and the aging process itself has a common factor, and that common factor is insulin resistance. So it's not just a diabetic disorder. Hello, how is everybody doing? Dr. CJ Benkert here with Pura Vida Wellness. Let me ask you a question. Do you know what the number one health disorder in the world is? What's the number one health disorder in the world? If you're watching this live, type it in the comments. If you're watching on my YouTube channel, type it in the comments. I'm willing to guess because I didn't even find out about this disorder until last year, 2020. Most of you are going to say heart disease, right? Heart disease kills more people than any other disease in the world. But what is the number one health disorder in the world that affects more people, adults and children, each year than any other health disorder? That's our topic for today. I'm going to spend the next 10 minutes revealing something that most doctors, endocrinologists, scientists don't know, which is insulin resistance. So when you hear the term insulin resistance, I'm willing to bet that most of you are thinking diabetes, insulin, diabetes. And that is true. Insulin resistance does lead to diabetes. But now we know, based on Benjamin Bickman's research and work and delving into the studies and the pathophysiology of the body, that most diseases, most chronic degenerative illnesses, diseases, and the aging process itself has a common factor, and that common factor is insulin resistance. So it's not just a diabetic disorder. Insulin resistance, why is it so prevalent? Recent studies, as recently as a year ago, are showing somewhere between 80 and 90% of Americans are likely insulin resistant. Again, get the word diabetes out of your mind right now, because I'm going to blow your mind with the information that I'm going to share with you, because most people, again, even most doctors and scientists don't know that insulin resistance is the start of most diseases that plague us, and insulin resistance is preventable. It's reversible. It's everything that my program addresses. So if I would have known 7 years ago when I started on this health and nutrition journey, and I developed this program with myself and my chiropractic patients first, and now have perfected this Pura Vida transformation system, that I was actually addressing insulin resistance, that I could put like a name on what it is that we're helping, how amazing would that be? But now I know what I know. It's changed my world. I am just finishing up a book on diabetes. It's finally getting sent to the editor this week for formatting. Yes. And I could have easily changed the title of my book, which is the Diabetic Weight Loss Solution, to Insulin Resistance. Because not only does our program help people with diabetes, but it helps people with high cholesterol and heart disease and autoimmune and cancer and all have fatty liver disease, metabolic syndrome, fertility problems, hormone problems, erectile dysfunction. Do you realize that every condition that I just stated is caused by, not just related to, but caused by insulin resistance? Are you blown away? Have I just blown your mind? If you care anything about health, if you know anything about health, if you want to live your best, purest life, which is what I'm about and why I'm here today, is I'm teaching my 12 core concepts to living your best, purest, healthiest, most amazing, joyous life. And I started with pure food as one of my concepts, and then we went into pure water as another concept. And this week we're going to be covering my third concept, which is fat burning versus sugar burning. And I have to start with my first lesson of the week with insulin resistance. So if you want to know more about insulin resistance, I'm going to do the Cliff Notes version today. If you want to know more about it, the way that I originally found out about it was the blessing of the pandemic. Was I've always been a constant learner. I've always been that nerd that gets all excited about going to school. I've always been that nerd that loves going to conferences, medical conferences, anti-aging conferences, functional medicine conferences, cancer conferences. I love that. Like that drives me. That's my passion. But what the silver lining of the pandemic is that I wasn't able to travel all around the world and go to these conferences. Because before the pandemic, once or twice a month, Dr. CJ was traveling to Chicago, to Hawaii, to Canada, to all these different places, learning about the new emerging science, meeting with other doctors and scientists that have a passion and a servant's heart that want to help more people. So I've always been about learning and growing and seeking out the truth. But what the pandemic did for me is it forced me to go online. It forced me to start looking online for trainings and YouTube videos and finding physicians out there that normally I would go and see in person speak about the newest discoveries and the newest science breakthroughs. Now I was sitting at home on YouTube getting in probably 10, 20, 30 times more information sitting at home than I ever would have been able to get traveling to different states and different conferences over that year's time. So in 1 year's time, the amount of knowledge and the amount of new information that I was able to soak in and learn was just phenomenal. And it has set me on this path to, I have to get this message out. There's too many people that are suffering unnecessarily. So if you want to learn more about insulin resistance, I'm just going to give the Cliff Notes version. I would highly recommend, and I've talked about this book before, Why We Get Sick by Dr. Benjamin Bickman. And this was just released, I think it was released last year. And he's got lots of stuff on YouTube. I've listened to many, many podcasts and interviews with different doctors and health frontiers or health crusaders interviewing him and asking him questions. So this book is amazing. It's written to the layperson to be able to soak in the issue of insulin resistance and why it's a problem, and he basically states his case. So as I said, insulin resistance is the most common health disorder worldwide. It affects more people, adults and children, every year than any other. Let's see. How do you know you have it? So I'm going to read off a questionnaire. So I want you to take this questionnaire. I want you to take this quiz. And I will post this quiz in my Facebook page so that you can take this quiz to determine whether or not you have insulin resistance. So how do you know you have it? Question number 1. Do you have more fat around your belly than you would like? Number 2. Do you have high blood pressure? Insulin resistance is directly related to high blood pressure. Insulin resistance causes high blood pressure. Wow! Question number 3. Do you have a family history of heart disease? Do you have high levels of blood triglycerides? Do you retain water easily? Do you have patches of darker colored skin or little bumps of skin tags at your neck, armpits, or other areas? Do you have a family member with insulin resistance or type 2 diabetes? Do you have polycystic ovarian syndrome or erectile dysfunction? Yes, both PCOS and ER are caused by none other insulin resistance. Do you think it might be a pretty important thing to learn about insulin resistance? Make sure you don't have it. Well, you know how you test for it? Testing your insulin in your blood. Does your doctor check your insulin? No. Your doctor checks your glucose. And glucose is the secondary thing that happens when you have insulin resistance. So briefly, what causes insulin resistance? Our diet. Everything that I always talk to you guys about. High carbs, sugar, eating a bunch of crap, processed food, packaged food. When you eat sugar, when you eat carbs, the pancreas releases insulin, which is a hormone, because when you eat sugar and carbs, those are broken down into simple sugars. So rice, pasta, bread, donuts, broken down into sugars. The blood sugar goes up. It can only go up so high before it becomes dangerous. The pancreas then is signaled to release insulin. Insulin is a hormone that grabs and locks arm with glucose. Sugar goes, come here, little sugar molecule, get over here. Come on, we're going to go in the cell. We're going to go in the cell and we're going to create some energy, or we're going to build some more fat. But when you're eating sugar and carbs, sugar and carbs, sugar and carbs, and there's chemicals and toxins that are affecting, oh, I don't have my little cell, that are affecting the cell membranes, the sugar can't get into the cell. So the insulin that normally would get the sugar in the cell is not working. So what does the body do? It makes more insulin and more insulin and more insulin. It's kind of like when you have a child that originally you're like, hey, get in your room, pick up your toys. And they're like, okay, all right, Mom, I'll go in the room, pick up your toys. And then they get busy and they get distracted. They're like, go in your room and pick up your toys. They don't hear you. You're like, go in your room and pick up your toys. And you're like screaming at them because they've just kind of like tuned you out. That's what your cells do to insulin when you're eating crap, when you're eating the standard American diet, the SAD diet. Your insulin, your cells become resistant. They don't hear the message of insulin. Glucose doesn't get in the cell. And the secondary thing that happens is the glucose levels go too high. So if you were to actually look at insulin levels, it would show up high way before somebody would ever have a diabetes diagnosis. So extremely important when you do blood work to check insulin. If you have high blood pressure, you're probably insulin resistant. So the specific effects of insulin depends on the cell. For example, when insulin binds to a liver cell, the liver cell makes fat, among other things. When insulin binds to a muscle cell, the muscle cell makes new proteins, among other things. From the brain to the toes, insulin regulates how a cell uses energy, changes its size, influences production of other hormones, and even determines whether cells live or die. Common among all of its effects is insulin's ability to have the cell make bigger things out of smaller things, a process known as anabolism. Insulin is an anabolic hormone. So insulin is a growth hormone. Insulin helps you grow, make new cells. So in the brain, insulin uses glucose for energy and neuron growth. Ears, the glucose uses energy for hearing, and the heart uses it for energy. The size of your heart lowers blood pressure. This is all normal insulin levels. Muscle, energy use, muscle production, fat, glucose conversion to fat storage, helps with growth, liver, fat production, glucose storage. The testicles and the ovaries, normal sex hormone production. Bone, energy use, growth. nerves, glucose use for energy and growth. Those are some pretty important functions of insulin. So what happens, let me just show you, and if you're listening on the podcast, I apologize, but I'm showing a picture of a body and all the different parts of the body and how they're related to insulin. You guys got that? Okay. All right, next. Again, this is just the summary. Next. Now we're talking about what I just said a few minutes ago, that when somebody is diagnosed with diabetes, it's the glucose isn't the problem. That's not the problem. The problem is insulin resistance that started with toxicity, stress, and diet. And this is what we see is when someone is before they become a diabetic, so the light colored bar is insulin, you're going to see high levels of insulin but normal levels of glucose. When you're doing blood work and your doctor's looking at hemoglobin 1AC and blood sugar, which is what all doctors run, they're going to say, oh, your glucose is normal, your glucose is normal. You're not diabetic, your glucose is normal. But they're not checking insulin, which you would check in the blood. And so you could be becoming a diabetic, you could be headed towards Alzheimer's, you could be having problems with erectile dysfunction, you could have high blood pressure and heart issues, but not even know that you have high insulin, that you're insulin resistant. And then by the time the diagnosis comes along, you have now high levels of insulin, and finally, years later, high levels of glucose. So diabetes is not a glucose problem. I bet you didn't know that. Okay, so the different things that insulin resistance causes. So the high blood pressure is because insulin, as I told you, is a growth hormone. So when you have high levels of insulin, because the cells are resistant and the pancreas just says, okay, I got to make more, I got to get the sugar down, got to keep making more. Those high levels of insulin create growth, specifically the endothelial cells of the arteries. They cause them to grow and thicken. When your arteries are growing and the small little heart endothelial lining of your blood vessels becomes thick, it's going to increase blood pressure. And the same goes with like erectile dysfunction. Glucose is necessary for blood flow. So if you have insulin resistance and you can't get glucose into the capillaries, you're not going to have an erection. And the same with PCOS. It has to do with insulin actually having an effect on sex hormones, specifically estrogen. And that is why insulin resistance actually causes PCOS. Now let's talk about cancer, and we're done. What do cancer cells love? Cancer cells love sugar. What does insulin do when it's too high? Remember, I told you it's a growth hormone. So when the insulin is very, very high, cancer cells are going to grow more. And cancer cells love sugar, so now you've got like the perfect storm. So here's a diagram showing insulin resistance. We're looking at the normal prostate, normal breast, so two areas commonly affected by cancer, prostate cancer and breast cancer. So normal prostate has very few insulin receptors and very little glucose use. But when you have insulin resistance, what happens? Now these cancer cells have increased insulin receptors and massive glucose use. So now you have these cells that are being supported by high insulin levels by continuing to grow, hence metastasis, tumors, etc. And now you've given the cancer cell the only form of fuel that it can use, which is sugar. So this is sugar burning versus fat burning. Today was all about, and I think it's the best place to start, we're going to go into more detail throughout the week. What is sugar? How does that react to your body? What other effects does insulin have on your body? Then we're going to go into fat and ketones. So we're going to cover all the details of this, but I had to start with insulin resistance because I know most of you don't know about insulin resistance. So I hope this helps. Let me know if it was mind-blowing for you as it was for me when I found out about it. But the good news is that insulin resistance is completely reversible. One other thing that I didn't cover that insulin resistance is directly related to. So we now know that Alzheimer's, and I'm actually going to cover that in a separate topic this week. Alzheimer's, they're now calling type 3 diabetes, because remember I talked about the neurons and the cells in the body. So neurons, or the brain, in order for the neurons and the brain cells to work, they have to have glucose. But if your neurons are insulin resistant because of the insulin being too high for too long, because of diet, because of toxins and chemicals, eating too high in sugar and too high in carbs, now your neurons, your brain cells are going to become insulin resistant. So now guess what can't come into your brain cells so that you can think, know who you are. Remember what happened yesterday. Glucose cannot get into your brain cell and it causes dementia. There's way more to it than this, but I just wanted to cover the main points and how prevalent this is, how preventable this is, and that my program addresses insulin resistance to its core. And I'm just really excited that I have something and I can share with you something that can have such a major impact on not just your health, but your family's health and anybody around the world that wants to have a better life. So this is Dr. C.J. Benkert. That's my summary of insulin resistance. I hope it helps. Tomorrow I'm going to come to you live and we're going to go into the dangers and the effects of sugar on the body. This is Dr. C.J. Benkert with Pura Vida Wellness, loving you, encouraging you, motivating you, inspiring you, educating you, knowledge is power, to live your purest, healthiest life in body, mind, heart, and spirit.